In this video, we're going to extend our understanding of the elasticity of demand. We're going to start to take a look at things not just mathematically in our, percent change. Just to kind of reiterate what we've been talking about. We've been talking about it mathematically from this idea of the percent change in the quantity demanded divided by the percent change in price, and we're getting this elasticity of demand coefficient and exploring if it's greater than 1 or less than 1. So to kind of fully visualize that, we're going to end up graphing things a little bit more just to kind of show characteristics of elastic or inelastic curves. So when we look at this elasticity of demand, let's explore the full range of the values that we could potentially have. So we could have a value where we take 0 divided by some number. All right, so let's look at that like this. So let's say we were to take 0 divided by, let's say, a 10% change. Right, so we have a 0% change in quantity even though the price changes. Right, this would equal 0. So our elasticity of demand coefficient would be 0. Right, so I'll say that again. So let's say the price changed by 10%. Right, but the reaction in the quantity was 0%. Now this could happen, and what we call this perfectly inelastic. Right, perfectly inelastic, and we'll highlight that. We'll show that a little bit more. Then we can change our range. We can say, okay, we had a 10% change in price, and remember, if we had a small reaction or a smaller reaction, we get something like 0.5. Right? And we called that something less than 1. So if the elasticity of demand coefficient is less than 1, it is therefore, we can say relatively or just inelastic, but I'm going to write down relatively inelastic. All right? And the next value, actually, well, what if we had a 10% change in price and an exactly 10% reaction? That would equal 1. Right, so we have 0, we have less than 1, we have 1, right? So if the elasticity of demand equals 1, what we call that is unit elastic. Means we have an equal amount of change in the price and in the quantity. Not amount of change, I shouldn't say that, but the percent change is the same. Then we could have values that are greater than 1, right? So we could have something like a 10% change in the price, and we have a 20 or greater percent reaction. And this would be something that's greater than 1. So this equals 2. So the elasticity of demand is greater than 1. And therefore, this is relatively elastic. Right? So this is no reaction. This is a small reaction. This is an equal reaction. This is a large reaction. All right, and then this last one is kind of on this extreme of perfectly again, is what if this top number, what if this approaches infinity over 10%? Or in another way, you could say, what if this bottom number doesn't change at all? If we have a 0% change and any percent change up at the top, right? And those are kind of equivalent statements. And so if this is 100% change, even if the price didn't change at all. Or you could say, as this approaches infinity, what happens to this number, right? What is infinity divided by 10, right? Well, it's approaching infinity, right? So this is where the elasticity of demand, right, is not only greater than 1, right, but it's approaching infinite. And so this, what we would call, is perfectly elastic. Right? So perfectly elastic means that the percent change in quantity is like, it's like infinite. It's like entirely, like the price can't change at all. Otherwise, the quantity would completely change. Everyone would stop buying it. All right, and so this is called perfectly elastic. And these are our ranges of elasticity from 0 to infinite. Now what we can do is we can kind of look at these things graphically. So we're gonna use our kind of two most common ones, which are relatively inelastic and relatively elastic, to kind of highlight what this looks like. So we know, right? So just to kind of show a common one is we can graph a demand curve, and it looks like this. We have price, and we have quantity, and we have this kind of downward sloping demand curve that looks like that, right? So what this is showing is that when the price goes from, let's say, this point and that quantity, right? So, so if the price is right here and the quantity is there, this is the price, this is the quantity, we know when the price goes up, the quantity goes down, and we end up at this point right here. Right? So this becomes P1 and this becomes Q1. Well, now with this knowledge that we have over here, we can compare these percent changes and see if from point A to point B, is this good elastic or is it inelastic? And we can measure that now. From A to B, is it elastic or inelastic? Because we can look at what is the percent change here, not the amount change, but the percent change. And then we can look at what's the percent change over here. And we can measure the value of elasticity for this good. So let's, without using numbers, kind of show an example using this large or small reaction without using numbers. Okay, so for this first one, we're going to say this is an example of something that's inelastic. Okay, so let's just start with 1 point on a demand curve. Okay, so this is price and this is quantity. And let's just start with this point. We'll call that point A. All right, so for inelastic, what does that mean? That means that it's very insensitive to price change. So if the price of this good from point A, which are these two coordinates of price and quantity, if this drops even by a lot, right? So the price drops by, I'm just going to make up a percentage, but let's say the price dropped by 50%. What do we know about how much the quantity is going to react when it's insensitive to price changes, when it's inelastic? Well, what we know is that the quantity will go up, but it will only go up by very little. So we might be at this dot right here. And then we can use these 2 points to kind of create our demand curve, which is a very steep demand curve. So this is an inelastic, a relatively inelastic demand curve, right? So maybe this is 10% reaction right there, right? So we had a 10% reaction in quantity and a 50% change in price. And making up those numbers without calculating anything, we can see that it is relatively inelastic. Okay, well, what would it look like if it was elastic? So if it's elastic, what I can look at is I can kind of, do that same sort of thing. So if I set up my price and my quantity and I pick the same point A, so let's call that point A again. I have my price and my quantity. And let's say this time we do the same thing. We had a drop in price of, let's call it 50%. But what do I know about the reaction now? Is the reaction going to be very small like it was, or is it going to be very large like that? Right? Well, we know that's going to be very large. It's going to be a big reaction. So the point might be way out here. And now if I connect those 2 points, I'm going to get a demand curve that looks a lot different than my last one. Still a downward sloping demand curve, but this time it's very flat. And that is a relatively elastic demand curve. So one of the rules, one of the takeaways here is the steeper the curve, that means the more inelastic it is. Right? The flatter the curve, the more elastic it is. Right? So what would you say if I had a curve that was perfectly steep or perfectly flat? Right? So what about this one where I have a demand curve that looks like that? What if that's my demand curve? What does that mean? Right? Well, what that means is even if the price went up, the quantity didn't change at all. Quantity's there, quantity or price goes up, quantity doesn't change at all, right? So what is it called when I have a percent change in price but no reaction? It is completely insensitive to a price change, right? So if I have a 10% change in price. The price goes up by, let's say, 10%, but quantity doesn't change at all, 0% reaction, right? Well, that equals 0, and that is what we call perfectly inelastic, right? Okay, well, what about the opposite side of things? What if I have a demand curve that looks like that? This is my demand curve, and I have a price and a quantity. What that means is that my price doesn't change at all, even if my quantity is changing. So if the quantity even goes up by, let's say, 10%, my price didn't change at all. Quantity goes up, price didn't change at all, right? So if I have a 10% change in the quantity, but I have the price isn't changing at all, right? This would be undefined, but it would technically kind of is approaching infinity. So this would be perfectly elastic. Okay? So these are some of our ways to visualize elasticity when it comes to demand curves.